And I can report to you that Zoom is getting ready. YouTube is getting ready to do a live stream. I have a nice little progress bar. Okay, and now we're live. So, hello everyone. I'm Keith Stone, your host for the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series, a production of Harvard University's Center for Hellenic Studies. And we are very happy to welcome today as our guest, for her second time as our guest, Olga Davidson. I'm going to give a little bio of you, Holly. She earned her doctorate in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton and is currently on the faculty of Boston University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilizations. Her book, Poet and Hero in the Persian Book of Kings, is now in its third edition, and her book, Comparative Literature and Classical Persian Poetry, is in its second edition. And we have a much longer list of Holly's accomplishments in the announcement for this event on our website. I should also add that Holly is a close associate of our most frequent guest on this show, Gregory Naj. Holly, so I'm going to just turn it over to you. Oh no, I promised that I would ask you my question, which is, how did your interest in the medieval Persian world begin?
Started with me being a classicist as an undergraduate and really liking the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then I once went home for Thanksgiving and saw an exhibition of the Houghton, what's called the Houghton Shahnameh, which is now called the Tasmach Shahnameh, which is all the miniatures of this epic. And I thought they were really beautiful, knew it was Indo-European, and decided that I wanted to read it in the original. This sort of helps being female because no one cares what you're doing. They just say, okay. Whatever. Then the classics department at BU was offering Persian and Arabic as a classical language. And so I started, first I was going to do Persian, but I couldn't, so I did Arabic instead. Then I went to summer school to do more Arabic and also do a Latin course with Glenn Bowersock on the Satyricon, the good old days when you could do really silly things in summer school. And that's when I met Greg. And then Greg and I fell in love and decided eventually to get married. Actually, we decided very quickly to get married. And then I decided it'd be really boring if we're in the same field. So I switched from classics to, this is really true, Persian and Arabic. And that's how we did it.
Okay, great.
But I never left classics, so I married one. How
true.
And then, then to continue, then I started learning Persian as a special student at Harvard, then I went to Princeton because they had a better program in both medieval Persian and medieval Arabic.
Well, thank you. And so now I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and you're going to talk to us about, oh God, I've totally blanked because I forgot to write down the title. Women's Lament in Epic. Women's Lament in Epic.
Women's Laments in Epic. Well, what I asked everyone to read is a comparison between Andromache's Lament and Takhmina's Lament. What I might give as background, because I don't know whether everybody knows what the Shahnameh is about beyond what I had written.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
I don't want to just talk blankly at somebody. So why doesn't somebody ask me a question? I assume you've all read the article. And before I start going on and dithering around laments, because I said quite a lot in the article, what I'd actually rather do is have somebody ask me a question just so I know where your reaction is.
I'm going to switch to gallery view so I can see a raised hand from Bill.
Bill.
Okay, so Persian epic. I really hadn't thought about Persian epic. At what time frame is the story set? I assume Bronze Age, in the distant past. How's it fit in mythical history and actual history?
Oh, that's a great question. This is a mythical history. Rustam is a mythical history. Basically, what the Shahnameh deals with in terms of the Shahnameh's worldview is the beginning of time up until the Arab conquest. which is one way of looking at it. And so you have kind of in the beginning, you have kind of a world order set up, but it's not like what you have within the Hesiod or something like that. It just is there. And if you really look, it's very comparable actually to Indic view of the beginning of time. But since the Shahnameh is, as we have it now, it's medieval as opposed to ancient or anything like that. It goes back and retroactively looks at the beginning of time as if the beginning of time was the Abrahamic view of the beginning of time, without mentioning that. If that makes any sense, you have that layering of the Abrahamic view on top of an Indic view. And so you have a lot of parallels with the Indic view. And then you have a lot of attitude from the Abrahamic view. Yet the whole thing is always Zoroastrian, because you don't have the Abrahamic view generated, because this is up until the Arab conquest. But it still is the national epic of Iran. And it's really beloved by Iranians. They love the Shahnameh. They quote the Shahnameh. They justify things with the Shahnameh. It is a living tradition, and a very active living tradition in Iran and outside of Iran. People love this epic.
When you say living, are you talking about performance? What kind of performances are happening?
Oh my God, yes. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite things is I actually saw a performance of the Shahnameh in the form of a play in 1999 in Tehran. And they did Tahmineh's Lament, which is why I really wanted to go see it. But in Iran, you can't dance or move or sing as a woman on stage, even though you could act as a woman on stage. So the woman who was being Tahmineh was very covered, but you could definitely see her face. I mean, she looked good. And then the other thing is that her body movements were really slow. So she would give the words, but the action, which I truly love, was they brought in some men who were shirtless. This is God's truth. They brought in some men who were shirtless, who were simulating the Ashura, beating of their shoulders and beating of their chests. And she was kind of doing motions like that. But these guys who were doing the Ashura type thing were very, very good looking. And it really sort of added a certain dimension to this particular performance. Now, if you look at that, is what was super interesting about that to me, which goes back to what I've said at the end of the article, when I was saying how Bachman just, they want to get rid of these lament of Tahmineh because it's so subversive, is what they'll do in modern day Iran is that they just turn the whole mourning part into mourning for Hussein. And so you can have, in the sense, Tahmineh becomes by default a Fatima figure mourning the death of Hussein. That's the implication by this. But it's a mother and son. And that's very sort of like, if you're going to do a mother and son, the way you just have any mother and son be Mary and Jesus. Does that make sense to you? So that's one example. Another example of how it's performed, which is actually really great, is in the States. They had a traveling shadow play. And the traveling shadow play was at Harvard. It was in Washington. I think it was even performed at the Kennedy Center. And they did a really clever job at it because they modernized it. And they did a different story. They didn't do Tahmineh. They did a different part of the Shahnameh. And they modernized it, and they brought in kind of jokes, little bits of jokes of what you would expect young people's reaction to, say, their parents always force them to listen to classical Persian music, into the actual place. It was a very living, I actually love this play. I thought it was the most brilliant thing. And it was, and it's still going on. This is kind of thing that happens. And then of course you have performances. I've been to performances where you just have somebody telling the story. They're called nakals, and they tell the story and they kind of act it out as the story, and they switch from actually reading the Shahnameh to retelling the Shahnameh. And there's a wonderful guy called Iraj Ashraf in the New York area. And he and I once did kind of a show and tell, both at the Center for Hellenic Studies and also at the Asia Society. And he would dramatically have this scroll that he would come out looking like he was reading the scroll, but he was telling the story in very, very colloquial Persian, and then occasionally then quoting from the Shahnameh.
Wow, that is really living. That's wonderful.
Very living, very, very living. Now can I go back to the lament part? Because now you're getting me going on the laments. There are something like 500 plus manuscripts of the Shahnameh. Some leave out the Shahnameh, they leave out the lament, and they just put it as appendix, and some keep it in. And so that's one of the reasons that if we look at that is that the lament in and of itself is sort of considered subversive, and that's the point of lament, which I've kind of explained, I think, in the article, but I can do more with that. Let me think.
And these are, I don't want to say ancient editions because it's not that old, but these are not simply modern critical editions or something that are leaving out bits and pieces.
They're not ancient.
As suspects, but
basically Ferdowsi's dated around 1060, 1066. No, wait a minute, 1010. Yeah, sorry, not 1010, 1010. That's the date they give Ferdowsi, 1010, our era. And then in his actual text, in the actual text, you have the source material, which is an oral source as well as a written source, but you have the idea in the text of a text that once existed and is discombobulated, is disassembled, and then really is gathered. I have all of this. I don't want to just bore everybody to death with this, but all of this is in my book, Poet and Hero. But anyway, the idea is you have a disassembled text and it's reassembled. And so you have in the sources that even Ferdowsi himself says, he has a story of Mobads, who are Zoroastrian priests, all coming up with a page in their hand. And then suddenly, one guy has page 1, another person has page 2, and that's how the text is reassembled. Mm-hmm. And that's one version. And then you have another one, which is again, the voice of the Shahnameh says, and then I confirmed this with Dekan, then there's also Dekan, so I hear this from a Dekan. So you have a double thing going on here, which makes it super interesting. And this is something that Greg just loves and loves and loves. This is one of our cheery moments way back when I was doing these things of talking about this endlessly. That's why this whole text is very interesting to classicists, because you have this idea, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. Wow. Okay.
But going back, and I could say one thing about laments is that the Tahmina lament, as I've said, is subversive because basically the hero, Rustam, he's considered the ideal. People love him. He's the person who keeps the king going. He's, you have him comparable to Achilles, but he doesn't have the same kind of I don't know what you say, childishness as Achilles. You don't have to have him imbalanced, but you do the imbalancing part. I've done a study of I've brought sort of Rustam into the model of the Dux Rex type thing that Greg has been recently working on in his blog for CHS. But and Rustam does have these things of crimes against the first and second, third function, but they're very subtle. But this again is always, I've already written about this, so I don't want to get too caught up in this. But in terms of the lament part, is that the fact that Tahmina, there's two things, is that she is a one-night stand, but they have a marriage in the very, okay, let me restart this. This is actually really important.
Mm-hmm. I was noticing that.
Yeah, all right. So let's, no, this, I have to say this, and I have to pepper this with really funny little comments too, is that when you read the text of the Shahnameh, you have Rustam, who is often seen as going off on his horse by himself. And he does this frequently. He has these moments when he just disappears and goes off on his horse by himself. And so while he's on his horse by himself, and then what he does when he's hanging out by himself with his horse is he usually shoots an onager and eats the whole thing. An onager is a wild ass. And so he lights a little fire and eats an entire onager, and then he falls asleep or something like that. And then usually something horrible happens to him. And he never seems to learn not to fall asleep after eating a gigantic meal. But then he wouldn't be Rustam if he didn't do that. And so in the Shahnameh, when he does this many times, but in this particular event, his horse is stolen. And so he's humiliated. He has to go back on, he has to walk around on foot without his horse to retrieve his horse, goes to the castle, so to speak, and then talks to the king there and says, my horse. And the king says, come in and spend the night and that type of stuff. And then in the middle of the night, this is the best part ever, Takhmina comes into his room, and they're wonderful miniatures of her sneaking into his room, completely veiled. And she does this great speech act. She says, nobody sees me. I'm the most private, I'm the most sheltered. I don't even like to use the word, I'm the most unseen person in the world. Barely fish or fowl have seen me, but I've heard about you, and I'm super attracted to you because of your hunting abilities. Rustam has done a lot of things by this point. He's put kings on the crown. He's done the equivalent of labors. Has done a whole bunch of stuff. So he has quite a good, CV in terms of being a really good dukes. And he listens to her, and then she says to him, and this is, she says to him, if you sleep with me and impregnate me, I will tell you, get your horse back for you. So basically her proposition is, impregnate me and you'll get your horse back. Now, this is parallel in the Dietrich saga with Brunhilde. I think, wait a minute, I'm trying to remember. In the Dietrich saga, if I am not mistaken, Siegfried basically is horseless, and Brunhilde promised him his horse should they hang out together, so to speak. I have to make sure, because I've only seen this in the Penguin edition to the Nibelungenlied when they do all these sources. So I do remember that. But what I always found very interesting about this is that you can really look at Takhmina as very much of a sort of an Artemis type figure, and who sort of thinks that way. And Rustam as somebody who, somebody like an Artemis figure would find very attractive, somebody who hunts really well. But you don't really mix up hunting and sex, really. I mean, they don't, go well together, especially with Artemis. So that's one thing I would say. Anyway, then you have in the line of the Shahnameh, in the middle of the night, you have this very, very quick marriage. Suddenly, okay, permission's given, they can get married, he can sleep with her, and then he's off the next day. And then when he leaves her, he gives her some armlets of jewels, and he says to her, if you have a girl, braid this in her hair. If you have a boy, put it on his arm so I can recognize him. And so that's how the tragedy happens. So then, Rustam, Zohrab grows up, asks his mother who his father is. She doesn't tell him. And he then really demands. And then she says, your father's Rustam, and here's the armlet to prove it, And then when Rustam goes and fights the Turanians, I'm being a little bit vague about this. Takhmina is sort of on the wrong side of world's cosmos. You have Iran, which is the right side, and Turan, which is, I don't like to say it's Turkey. At this particular point, it becomes Turkey, but right now it's just Turan, which is not Iran, is the best way of putting it. You have sort of Iran, Turan, and Chin, which is anything east, so Turan is anything there. Rum is anything west, and Iran's in the middle of the world, and Turan is the non-Iran, is the best way of putting it. And everything in Turan is, wrong as up to a certain point. Anyway, the Turanians are attacking Iran, and Zohrab is this amazing warrior, and Rustam is called forth to go fight Turan. And first he refuses because he doesn't take it seriously. He doesn't like the king very much. And then but then he finally confronts Sohrab, but he never tells Sohrab who he is, and nobody tells Sohrab who Rustam is. So they're fighting each other incognito. This is very parallel if you all read the Toyn, when Cuchulainn goes and confronts Conla. Cuchulainn knows that Conla is his son, but kills him anyway. But in this case, he didn't know. So when Sohrab is dying, this is the most beautiful thing he says to him, to Rustam, is Rustam comes and sees him and, bends over him. And when he's dying, Sohrab says to him, you can run and you can hide, but no matter where you go, whether you try to change yourself into a fish or turn yourself into a bird, my father Rustam will come and avenge me. And that's what you realize. But what I like especially about this is the bird and the image of the bird and the image of the fish, which is very evocative of Takhmina's shelteredness, as she describes herself, or her virginity, or whatever you want to call that. And so when you have this image of Takhmina as she goes through her lament, when she says, you were looking for your father, the way I've fleshed it out all in that article, it is so powerful when she says, how, who would take a dagger and just tear out somebody's navel, and all the things that she says. It's very, very powerful what she says. And I did once talk about this. I gave a talk about this lament at the University of Tehran. I'm sort of an offshoot of it to a group in Persian. And but when I basically said it was a one-night stand, there was kind of a gasp, but then not really, because I did point out it's exactly one line in the Shahnameh where you have this mentioning of their getting married, and it's in the middle of the night. And then you juxtapose that with another sort of wonderful other lament, which is in the Alexander story. Now we're talking about Alexander the Great. Is the Shahnameh incorporates Alexander the Great as one of its kings. And the way that works is that there's a Darius, there's a couple of Dariuses, not quite the same, but there's a Dara, and a Dara has a concubine, and she's got bad breath. So he sends her back, and that happens to be Alexander's mother. Alexander's born, raised by Philip, and then he comes to rightfully claim his kingship. And the second Dara that's there is his brother, and who's his younger brother. So he actually is the rightful heir to the throne. And that's how Alexander comes to being. And so you have a fight. Alexander conquers Dara. Dara's last dying breath is, gee, this is fine with me. After all, I'm the younger brother and this is all wrong. Do me a favor and please be really nice to my daughter, Roxanne, and marry her. And so now, if you look in terms of how Persians would feel about, at the time, how Persians felt about Alexander's conquest was not, very fondly, since he trashed all the Zoroastrian temples. But as far as the Shahnameh is concerned, they don't do that. What they do is they turn Alexander into somebody who's a little bit confused. He's a Sufi, even though he really predates Islam. He's a Christian, even though he really predates when Christianity started. So it gets all sort of weird. But basically, he's presented as somebody who's seeking eternal life and takes the wrong fork in the road. But when he dies, you have a moment for Roxana, and she's supposed to lament him. And it's the best, non-lament ever, because she essentially says, you conquered a lot. There's not much left of anything that you've done. You conquered a city here, you conquered a city there, you conquered all over the place, but it's all sort of falling apart. And now you're dead, so sucks to be you.
Not even for me.
Not even for no, not even
which is a
remotely
usual
for
thing
me.
you would
Just
expect.
sucks to be you. Just basically sucks to be you. I love that so much because it's the most wonderfully clever way of the Shahnameh to incorporate and sort of be nice about Alexander, but then have Roxana basically saying what everyone's really thinking.
We're better off without you. We're not even sad.
We're not even remotely sad.
But you're sad.
But, you know, the whole story is very much, you know, very parallel to what you find in pseudo-Callisthenes. And everyone's complaining, you know, claiming Alexander and stuff like that.
Hmm. Let me just switch
More
to
lament?
here.
Yeah. Do you want more lament stories?
Well, I see a question from Hélène here.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, this is a question about lament. You know,
Yes.
I was wondering, first, thank you for giving us this wonderful presentation. I was wondering about Rustam's mother. I think her name is Rudabe.
Yes.
And does she also sing a lament?
She's too sad. So there's no lament. She, you know, she is so upset that she just becomes catatonic. But the other thing about when Rustam dies, he's not exactly in the blush of youth. He's lived for about 500 years. And so, but when Rudabe finds out that he died, they very specifically say no lament. She doesn't lament at all because she's too sad. Her emotions aren't there. And I think at that particular point, and one of the reasons for that in the actual epic is that you have to move on to another part of the next thing. You know, that's the end of the mythic part of the Shahnameh, and then you move on to the historic part of the Shahnameh. But that's a great question. I really like that question because the marriage of whatever is the arrangement of the, you know, the marriage of Rudabe and Zal, that whole, what you call in Persian, the khastagari, the whole arrangements of that marriage goes on forever. Oh my God, that is, you know, goes on for you know, hundreds and hundreds of lines of, you know, all the negotiations and all of that kind of stuff for the actual marriage of Rudabe. And it's, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to get too involved in it, but it's very much of a Rapunzel story. You know, Zal climbs up her hair and does all sorts of things, and she's very saucy. She invites him in his room. She sees him. She gets her handmaidens to go check him out at a with water in a water area, very Nausicaa-like. And so there's a lot of parallels, a tremendous amount of parallels with the Greek tradition in the Shahnameh. But no, Rudabe, you know who also doesn't lament? This is one of my favorite non-lamenters because she's so angry. Is when you read the Poetic Edda and also the Nibelungenlied, Kriemhild does not lament. And in the Poetic Edda, when Sigurd is killed, Grimhild is so angry. She is so absolutely livid, angry, white anger. And all the women come around her and say, "Go let it out. You know, I lost my son. Wah, wah, wah. I lost my husband. Wah, wah, wah." They all do that kind of lament. They do their lament, trying to get her to lament. And she refuses to say anything. And then in the Nibelungenlied, which I really like, I'm sorry, I'm really going off track and being completely lunatic at this point, but it's so good. When you have in the Nibelungenlied, there's two things which I like to point out, which is the Nibelungenlied is always very obsessed with clothes. And have you all read the Nibelungenlied? All right, they really care about what everyone was wearing at every single time. And so when Kriemhild finds out that Siegfried is dead, she lets out a cry, and suddenly all the Nibelungen, you know, whatever is Siegfried's kind of army that seems to be there, but not there, but is there, they suddenly, you know, run to see what's happened, and then they realize they have no clothes on. That's just a little detail that I was very amused at. Then the other thing, but it was very apt, you know, obviously it was a metaphor that they were kind of, you know, they were in a dangerous situation. Then when she goes off to Etzel or Atli in Hungary, and invites Gunther and Hagen to come and have dinner, so to speak. They bring Volker, who's a minstrel, and Volker is busy recording everything with his bow as he's singing what's going on, so to speak. And then he's sort of jabbing people with his bow and killing them as the blood is piling up. But then they have this wonderful comment. Volker makes this wonderful comment: "What a foul feast Kriemhild has brought to us." Now, it's not a lament, but that's sort of, if you don't lament, in many ways you have, I mean, I don't like to really compare it to the Greek woman who takes a dagger and says she's going to kill anybody, but you do have the idea of the sacrifice. If that lament doesn't happen, you're just going to sacrifice. You don't care who. You're going to sacrifice somebody if you're not going to actually listen to someone's lament. And in Kriemhild's case, she's so angry that she just wipes everybody out. Mm-hmm. And also, another person in the Nibelungenlied, I have to say, is that there is a character called Hadubrand. There's Hildebrand and Hadubrand, and in that situation, you also have a parallel story, and I think also it's in the Dietrich Saga, of a father killing his son unwittingly. So that's a Hildebrand and Hadubrand story.
Mm-hmm. Jenna, I saw you had something you wanted to say.
I have a question about Tahmina's lament. You said it's a protest, and she doesn't honor the armor of Zohrab, I believe. Right. Can you talk more about this protest? Thank you.
Absolutely. With her action is that what she does is she takes all of his armor, and instead of passing it on to somebody else, she takes it and she distributes it. So for wealth. So she distributes it to a peaceful way of doing it. She takes his armor and turns it into plowshares, so to speak. And the docking of the horse's tail, because she said, and then she's also dashing her head against his shoulder, and also, the saddle and all that kind of stuff. So she really goes all out, but she does not make a continuation of Zohrab. It's nipped in the bud, it's over. So, and then she also docks the horse's tail. Now, docking the horse's tail was done at the time. It's kind of a Zoroastrian thing, but one of the things which I always look at, and I just mention it, is turning him into a plow horse. And I've talked to a lot of Iranians because they've never thought about this, but I grew up in Europe, and I noticed that every time, with a lot of, plow horses and horses pulling sleds and stuff like that, and they would dock the horse's tail so you wouldn't have the horse's tail swishing in your face, whereas the stallion's tail is, all kind of part of its kind of, coolness. But if a horse has got a docked tail, it means it doesn't swish anywhere. It's not, I mean, it can't swish the flies away, but it also can't get you can't swish you in the face when you're behind pulling it. And so that's, to me, was something of looking at it, with the docked tail. Going back to the idea of almost, making something stop, this is another part, which is Fatima. Fatima is Hussein's mother. She is the only surviving child of Muhammad, his one daughter, Fatima. And the stories where you have with Fatima, she was, I don't know, I don't want to get too much involved. Well, anyway, I'll just say quickly, is in early Islam, you have Fatima. Fatima had 2 sons and 2 daughters, with Ali, who was Muhammad's cousin and one of his, almost like a brother to him. He was the 4th caliph. And Fatima, when there was sort of, arguments about succession after a while. It's complicated, but not really, but that's Islamic history. But you have this moment where part of the community of the nascent Islam did not want to follow the caliphs, the caliph after Ali's, who was starting a dynasty with the Umayyads, because you had one person called Muawiyah, and then suddenly, you know, you're going to have this son. So there was an objection because there was never a thought of having the caliphs becoming a dynasty, an Arab dynasty to boot. And so there were some who said, no, we're going to follow the line. We're going to follow a different kind of dynasty. We're going to follow the line from Muhammad. And so the grandsons of Muhammad were reticent. They didn't want to pledge allegiance to the son of Muawiyah, the dynasty. And so there was friction at that particular point. And then they left with something like only 70 people, went into the desert, and they were besieged. And this is a huge thing in Shia story. And they were besieged, and then eventually Hassan had already been killed, and Hussein was killed. And then what the Umayyads did was they dragged the women unveiled into Damascus, brought Hussein's head, did all this, you know, did all this stuff that was in, you know, a little much to do, especially considering this was Muhammad's grandson. And so this becomes a theme of Tazia plays where you are going, we just went through Ashura a couple of weeks ago, where you'll have these plays, the whole Passion plays being reenacted on Ashura, which is the 10th day of Muharram, which is certain today changes. And so this is a huge Shia celebration. Now, where am I going with this? I'm going somewhere with this. Wait a minute, oh yes, going back to Fatima. Is Fatima herself, when she dies, she insists that no one knows where she was buried, and she disappears completely. And she doesn't want, and you know, she has this huge thing of not wanting anyone to mourn her or do anything for her. Thereby, her memory is remembered forever. You always think of Fatima. Fatima is, to this day, likened to Mary mourning Jesus, but you cannot think about Fatima except as a woman who was wronged and whose son was killed wrongly. And so it continues. And that's, you know, you'll see this over. I mean, this is so important in the Shia world.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
I'm sorry, I did do one thing, which I have an article. It's in an Oxford book on Islam or something like that. And they asked me, they asked me to do something about protest. And I did specifically do combination of, I did an Aisha protest and a bio-lamentation and a Fatima thing. I basically showed this. And what lamentation can do, if you go to Aisha's case, is that you do things in lamentation that evokes passion. It is the absolute opposite of eulogy. You're not going to praise and say, boy, this guy was great, you know, let's remember him. You are going to get everybody very, very upset that this person had died. That's the point. And that's why church fathers usually kind of stop lamentation. Definitely it's considered suspect, but it exists today. I mean, there are cases of lamentation. There's a graphic comic book there's a wonderful graphic comic book about how many kids had died in the 2009 riots after Ahmadinejad was, after the elections were basically manipulated and everyone protested. There is a wonderful graphic comic book with a character called Sohrab, and you have this really good picture in it of an open mouth with this long, as I said, it's a graphic novel with an open mouth with this tongue coming out with all the anger that a mother would feel to have her kid killed. Wow. It's called the Zahra's story. Actually, I have it. If you don't mind, I can run and show it to you. Do you want me to do that?
Sure.
Okay, hang on.
Keith, I got a question on female suicides when you get a minute.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I also have a question.
This is the book called
Okay.
Zahra's Paradise. And while you're asking the question, I'll find the picture. Okay, I'm listening.
Go ahead, Bill.
So a while back, you mentioned the Eddas. So for those that don't know, in Norse mythology, the god of everything wonderful was Balder, and the gods accidentally killed him. So absolute hysteria breaks out all over the universe. So his
Right.
wife Nana doesn't get much of a chance to lament, but she throws herself on the funeral pyre. And rather famously, there's a few examples in Greek mythology of that happening. Do widows kill themselves in Persian epic?
No.
No. Cool. Short answer. That's what I wanted to hear. Thanks.
Yeah. No, I can't think of a single moment when they may sort of say, gee, you know, I'm going to die, but no one throws themselves on a funeral pyre. They're much too sensible. Yes.
Yeah,
Georgia.
Thank you very much for introducing Persian epic and for all the inspirations. Since you mentioned in your article, you compare the Iliad to the Persian epic,
Yes.
and actually you point out the similarities. I would like to point out some, let's say, differences, and actually the one that comes in mind, and please tell me if I'm wrong, because I don't know obviously the Persian epic in depth, is that the lamentations in the Iliad, for example, the 12 we have, are always in dialogue with the bystanders, with the audience.
Right.
And in the Persian epic, I'm afraid, or I don't see any dialogue there, or any interchange, or any, let's say,
No, it's all in one big piece. Actually, that is a really, really good thing, because generally you do have a idea of a group around you. And this is very, very carefully spelled out by Benedicta Grima when she looks at the Afghani laments or Pashto laments in the Northwest frontier. Is in those cases, and this, she does a really good job with this, is that something happens, and then the person who's going to the lament, I always use this as to get my husband to be on the point. I say, do the Pashtun lament series. First you say what happens. My son fell off the ladder. Something like that. Then all the women come and say, what? Your son fell off the ladder? How did he fall off the ladder? And then, he was going up a ladder. And then you can have this wonderful thing of, he was climbing up the ladder. What kind of ladder was it? It was a little ladder. Was the rungs this? And then you get all the details as people ask, but you have the idea of the audience of lamenter wanting the lamenter to really elaborate. And so, and this is sort of a way of, this is the one sort of great public discourse that one has. Now, let me just show you how something happened in modern day, which is super powerful. A couple of years ago, do you remember when there was this horrible case of a woman who was absolutely attacked and practically torn to shreds in Afghanistan? And her name was Farhunda. Okay, so in case you didn't, and I have a little article about this, and if you go to something called the Mizan publication, I have an article about this, and I'll sort of somehow give it to Keith for you to see this. This was a really interesting thing. This woman who was torn to bits, she was basically almost a Salafi. She was very, very veiled, and she had challenged somebody outside who was selling amulets or whatever it is outside of a mosque or area in Kabul. And he started screaming and saying that she's desecrating the Quran, anything. And people went absolutely batshit on her. Excuse my language, I shouldn't do this. I realize this is being recorded. But they went nuts on her. And she was literally, all these men just went after her, and it was horrible. And so you have then what happened afterwards is people were horrified. Everybody was sort of horrified of what happened. Why did this happen? What has she done? This and that. But instead of driving it under the cover, her father just was so horrified, he absolutely refused to let this go. But then women, and this is really powerful, what women did is that they said that they were going to carry her body to the burial site. And her father said that the women do. Normally, women don't participate in funeral, in Afghanistan, in funeral rituals. Normally, it's done very, very privately, especially if a woman dies. But in this case, what they did is that they all wore masks on their faces, which was a picture of what her face looked like after she was bloodied up. So all these women took her took her body and escorted the body to the burial place, and in droves, with these masks on, to show and rub into the society, look what men did to women. It was very, very, very powerful. And then and very talked about. And then so that was one thing. And then I don't mean to be facetious, but this was a very interesting case. There is something called Afghan Star, which is, like whatever, what's the one we have here with what's her face, Paula Abdul, everybody judging, so you want to be a star, American, what's it called? American Idol? No, is it American Idol?
American Idol, I think.
Thank you. Okay. Or whatever the British one is. They have something called Afghan Star. And there was a girl who made the way up to, she was the, she made it up to, she was almost won it, but she was up to the final group, and she was number 7 in the final group. And what she did for her performance is that she took a protest song from a very famous, kind of a protestish song from a very famous Afghani poet that everyone knew. And she excerpted from it in her song, things that would make you think of what happened to Farkhunda. And in the meanwhile, her dress that she wore is that she appears on stage and she's wearing the sort of, the blue burqa that you see in all Afghani women wearing. And then, midway through her song, she throws back she reveals her face and throws back her burqa so you can see her face. And underneath, she's wearing this dress that's made to look like it's torn and ragged, but it's, it's a dress that's very sort of patched and stuff like that. And so she reenacts the entire thing for Afghan Star. And then, oh my God, the amount of hate mail she got. It was amazing. That was the part that was really interesting. People just hated it or they loved it. It was on YouTube, and I can't remember when I did but I studied it very carefully. And it was a fascinating thing. Just
a last drop. Thank you so much. Just because you mentioned reenactment, and I think, for example, Brisset's lament for Patroclus actually involves the reenactment of the women's who respond to her lamentation, because they used Patroclus as a pretext. It says prophecies. Right. And to remember their own problems. This is very nice. And actually, I'm just my last comment, thank you very much again, it's how Iliad finishes with Helen's lament. Right. Where the response is not the women anymore, but the people. So it's involving, the bigger group, the bigger idea. So.
Yes.
Could I jump in with a question?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Kat.
I'm this is going back to the beginnings of time.
Yeah.
You mentioned when you started off talking about the Persian epic, you mentioned all the, Zoroastrian, Abrahamic, so on and so on. And my question is there really any study, I'm sure there is, about the Indo-European roots of epic in general, so Hellenic, Persian, Nordic, and so on?
Yes, there is. That's Dumézil, Georges Dumézil.
Uh-huh.
And he basically, what he does is that he studies in a very comparative way myth in Indo-European societies. And his thing was, I always, the way I've always thought of him is just like Meillet was doing Indo-European linguistics, he basically did the same thing with Indo-European myths. And so you have, however you have in the beginning, but basically he was the person who said, you have the Indo-European society broken up into 3 types of classes: priest kings, king warriors, and health, wealth, and fertility types. And then you have outside of that scribes and smiths.
Okay, and what about epic? I mean, does it also, in terms of the trends in epics and how epics develop in the various societies?
Yes, but each epic has its own way. I mean, if you look at I don't know how the Iliad begins, because it just begins with Achilles being cranky. But you don't know the beginning of you get that from Hesiod, because, what I always tell people in classics is, you've got the whole epic cycle in the Shahnameh. From, they start from the beginning of the world, so to speak. But but in that case, is that if you're going to look at it with the Shahnameh, it's the earliest one would be something like looking at the Mahabharata, or the Indic epic, even the Vedas, how does the world begin? And so you have the taming of the beasts or something like that. There's a character who tames the beasts, and there's wonderful miniatures of him sitting there. He's always sitting on a throne looking very kingly in the miniatures, but then there are all the beasts around him. And then you have another one, this guy called Jamshid, and he goes and divides up the world and gives everybody their function. So he's the person who at first says, then you have the idea of health, first, second, and third function, and smiths and scribes as being the separate function. Separate things, but outside of the outsiders as opposed to insiders. I hate to use the word outsiders, but just not part of being first function, second function, or third function. If I'm making no sense about this, I know Greg has been writing about this nonstop for the past couple of weeks.
8 weeks.
Mostly fussing about Stockadr.
Yeah, and he'll be our next guest.
Well, there you are. You can ask him.
Yeah.
Pass it on to him.
I wanted to ask, are there laments for women? You referred to a couple of protesty actions on behalf of women who had died unjustly in later examples, but do women not just perform lament, but get lamented?
They do get lamented in real life, big time. And I'm trying to think about, in the Shahnameh, is there a woman that dies that people are sad about? I can't think of one off the top of my head, because usually it's basically is there anybody who dies? I don't think so. But in real life, you have laments. I mean, they're wonderful laments. There are wonderful laments where you will go and, if you lose your daughter, if you want to get everybody really upset about losing your daughter, just talk about her party shoes, and that she's no longer going to wear her party shoes, wear her ribbons. You're going to put them on her hair, but you can't put them on their hair. This is, there are countless examples, even today, of if somebody dies and you're sad, you're not going to say, oh, it's very, you just don't say, oh, it's God's will. Or something like that. That's sort of, but if you want to express emotions and all sorts of things, is that you'll say, my daughter died. She, I can't braid her hair. I was just looking for her. Oh my God, there's her little plaid school uniform. And you can get really, really upset about listening to that.
Yeah. Wow. How about male figures in Shahnameh who perform laments? I'm thinking of Achilles lamenting for Patroclus. He takes on a kind of a women's song tradition, as Greg always talks about, in that kind of a scene.
Oh.
How about that?
Well, in that case, people will just say, oh, yes, isn't it sad that somebody, Rustam is really, really upset after he kills Sohrab. Super upset.
The men just kind of comment on it and say,
they comment. Well, sad. He just says, what he tries to do is undo it. And so he tries to bargain. He goes up to Keikaus and says, "You got the ability, use your magic, bring him back to life." And Keikaus says, "The last thing I need are two of you, because you're subordinate and kind of an annoying person to have around. I'm not going to have two of you." So that's why Keikaus won't bring Sohrab back to life. So Keikaus has these magical abilities, and Rustam tries to bring him back to life. There's another thing which is really fun, is that there is a alternative Sohrab story where he doesn't, it's not a one-night stand, and he doesn't die, and everyone lives very happily. And that, I think, is in the Borzurgname. So you have alternative parts of the Shahnameh, what if maybe they were happy, and that kind of stuff too. So you can sort of undo the whole thing. But the actual story of Sohrab and Rustam, if you go and do any miniatures, if you Google Sohrab and Rustam and look for images, you'll get so many. But they usually will always have Sohrab be baby faced, because they really want to show how young he is, and Rustam having a beard. But if you actually look at the timeline, or in terms of Rustam's career, Rustam's barely 14. If you're going to give him an age, I mean, it's he goes on for quite a bit in the Shahnameh, but at this particular point, this is early in his heroic career.
Mm-hmm.
So he's Achilles' age. How's about that? However, what old you want to say Achilles is.
Right.
Yes.
Maria.
Yes, can you hear me?
Maria. Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for this. I would call it intersectional presentation, because it cuts through, classics, anthropology, and of course Iranian and Persian literature. So as a person that you know these fields, classics and anthropology and Persian literature, I was wondering whether, as soon as you started talking, I don't know, my mind went, apart from the lament, to some other songs that usually fall under what we can call female social territory. Mm-hmm. And these are lullabies. Personally, having experienced a lament during a funeral, which was performed in a village in Greece, mm-hmm. I couldn't help thinking, when the woman performed the lament, that this was some kind of lullaby. And I also, having thought the tune of some Greek lullabies, I mm-hmm. couldn't also help thinking that these lullabies are not happy at all. At least they do not convey a happy mood. So now my question is, have you come across any affinities between lullabies and laments, or the ones have nothing to do with the others?
In many ways, Takhmina's words are lullaby-ish, because she's all over the place. But she does say, I held him, I nurtured his body, and then why did you do this? So she goes through these things, but you can see her, and then oh, wait. Oh, I can't take it down. It's too hung up. I was just going to say, I bought this miniature of her, which is kind of a kitsch miniature in the back. Maybe I could just take my computer and show it to you. Hang on. Because it's kind of good. It's not that she's crying because of, do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, you saw it. Okay. So that is a miniature, a recent miniature. On the whole lament is is written on that miniature. But what I like about that particular miniature is they have her you know, in many ways that kind of is evocative of what you're doing. She is there, but she's crying because he's dead, but he's there as if he's sleeping. So you have that kind of thing, saying sort of as if he's sleeping, and there she is, and her hair, notice her hair is all unraveled, very much the way that, very much the way Andromache's hair is unraveled. And that's another thing. And then, you know, in modern day moments, that in Afghanistan, for example, this is what Benedicta Grima says, this is the one time where a woman can run through a hospital screaming and yelling in her nightgown, and no one's going to blame her for that. Oh, you've gone mute. Have I gone mute? Or I'm mute?
No,
Oh,
we can hear
you're
you.
mute. Okay.
Maria just muted herself again.
Okay, got it.
So, yes, Robert, one last question here before we wrap it up. Let me see. Okay.
Oh.
Now you're on.
Okay, thanks. So this whole concept of laments is new to me, but it seems you argue in your article that these are not just stylized behaviors in epic, but reflect real behaviors of real women, apparently across vast differently cultures. So my question is, if people are engaging in that behavior, it must be to satisfy certain needs. And what are the lament-like behaviors that are present in Western culture? I mean, are there things going on in the United States that I should look at and say that's a lament-like behavior?
I don't think so, because our reaction always is to don't cry, go to a funeral. We get very, I mean, it depends on who you're talking to, but we tend to get very Anglo-Saxon about this, or very, you know, you just don't have it. You bury somebody, but you're not going to go on forever saying it's terrible that this person has died. You put them to rest, and you always say, you know, you always have the, I mean, it's just like saying, I mean, where you could get this going is with school shootings. But in many ways, if you have news things of, you know, so-and-so would have been alive, you know, with the Sandy Hook people, and they always have shows pictures, so-and-so would have been alive, they would have had this moment. Oh, I'll give you an example, which I kind of like. There was an opera I saw last summer called Blue that was commissioned by Francesco Zambello for, and it was about basically the killing of Black men by police. And in this particular opera, they have a policeman who's a policeman and his son. They're both African American. And the son is kind of a smart ass and an annoying and hates the police and can't believe his father's a policeman. And then a policeman, not his father, but another policeman kills his son completely unnecessarily. And then you go through the father's utter anger and despair and fury about having his son killed. Then I'm afraid my husband completely lost it at this, because then you had a Baptist minister, and then they make it all right, and they say, you know, this is it, and one has to forgive, and one has to go through this and that. So you have that kind of you know, one has to let it go and redeem yourself. But then they have this wonderful moment in the opera, which I really liked. It's going to be shown in Washington, I think, sometime this. I saw it at Glimmerglass. But then they had this really great moment of what if the kid lived. And here they have, and then the kid, if he had lived, you have this shot in the opera of, you know, would it be marvelous as the parents are imagining them sitting at a table with the child still there, and the child's coming back, and he says, I'm at RISD, I'm at RISD, and he goes to RISD, he's an artist and all this kind of stuff. So what could have happened if he hadn't been killed by the police? But in many ways, we have that going on now, but we tend to, I mean, as a culture, as Americans, we tend to stifle lament very, very quickly. It's used a lot. One of the things which I found the most offensive thing that Daesh did is there was, you know, an Arabic lament. One of the things that there's an Arabic motif, this is pre-Islamic motif, is women used to go into the middle of battle, and then to egg the warriors on, would say things like, what's going to happen to me if you die? The same thing that Andromache does, you know, don't go and die because this is what's going to happen to me. So please don't go and die. And one of the most famous ones is Al-Khanza, who did this. And what I really despised with Daesh, this is ISIS, but I call it Daesh, is that there was somebody who called herself Al-Khanza and was using whatever it is to go and recruit people to join Daesh. So that was a very cynical use of a lament motif. What's the other one that one can have? Oh, in early Islamic history, Aisha, who's Muhammad's favorite and youngest wife, she laments the death of Uthman, even though she didn't really care for him very much, but she does this huge thing about the third caliph that was killed. They all had a kind of a short lifespan. She laments, she calls this a civil war, but she first does this whole thing of, she uses lament and she uses artifacts and everything to arouse passion, to create a civil war. And that's the, and then she's in the, on her camel, basically egging her troops on, and then Ali goes and hamstrings her camel, and that's the end. And then she lives, quietly, somewhat quietly after that. You don't hear much more about her.
Well, thank you. We have to stop it there, unfortunately. So that was wonderful.
Well, thank you for having
Appreciate
me.
it. Yeah, it's been a long time. We should have you back sooner next time.
Well, I'll talk about something else.
Oh, maybe not.
Horses.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whatever.
Bye, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.